they're still sort of in the air, right? I mean, this wasn't the end of a negotiation. This was the beginning, right? It's extraordinary to think that since the steak dinner, this is the first time we've really sat down together. We're sort of 6 weeks in, 7 weeks to go, or 7 weeks in, 6 weeks to go, and we're just kind of framing out what the contours of a deal are supposed to look like.
So how do you handicap it if you think March 1st is a deadline, if it is?
You know, this would be a super high degree of difficulty landing for anybody to stick. This team is particularly, unconventional in terms of how we're handling this whole thing. What we do know is the Chinese are willing to do a bunch of big transactional components here, buy a bunch of stuff. They need to, whether it's from Australia, Canada, United States, Brazil. They need the stuff. We got some of the stuff they need. The part that's going to be much tougher and is going to be passed off to more senior staff to handle in Washington later this month are the big structural pieces of this. Are China willing to put SOEs a little bit more in a box, for example, state-owned enterprises, excuse me? That stuff's going to be much tougher. So we're just partway into this.
But let me ask you this, in terms of the different chess pieces, one of the other things that's happened is, for example, the arrest of the Huawei executive, things like that. Do you think some of that stuff gets resolved as part of this?
You can't, right? This stuff is hard enough just by itself if you protect it from all the politics.
But
if you start layering in...
But ZTE became part of the politics.
You know, all the politics, the ZTE, the detention for possible extradition of a Huawei executive, not a full-blown arrest yet, right? Those elements are the context, and they remind us what the stakes are. If we don't have a kind of rule of law, similar approach to how you negotiate deals, then all sorts of stuff can come apart at the seams. It can be awfully hard to do business if we don't have an agreed framework for how we go about this.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just ask, in terms of just the way the economy is working now and how that influences the negotiations. It seems like we worry about a hard landing in China every 2 years, and China has a pretty standard playbook as to the way they deal with it. What are your thoughts on that now? We saw them cut the reserve requirement last week. Are you going to see more stimulative actions from China to ease the path for which to give them more time to negotiate?
Yeah.
Or
there are 2-year cycles, there are 5-year cycles, and then there are 50-year cycles in an economy, and China's especially. A lot of the heavy structural stuff the U.S. is saying has to be in a deal. This is new. This is not just something that happens to happen every couple years. This is stuff that needs to get put on track for the decades and decades ahead. China has to do it. The slowdown confronting China right now, the pressure on them, if they don't deal with these questions of how do we get state enterprises out of the way so that better private companies can play a bigger role, China has to do that for its own sake, not just for ours. And that is, it's a whole new era in terms of the headwinds China's facing if it doesn't figure out how to do that.
The market's immediate concern, though, the market's immediate concern is, are we going to come to some sort of agreement that both sides can really walk away from and say, okay, this is a deal, and obviously that may not be able to be completed by March 1st, but are we on track for that?
Well, I mean,
and is there the push on both sides to want that?
The daily part of the market story, you're absolutely right. Folks are looking at close end. Is there a little bit of a positive spin coming off of these 2.5 days of talks in Beijing? And the answer to that is yes. But there's a big part of the markets here. There's trillions of dollars sitting at the doors of China deciding whether to go long for the decades, right? Nowhere on earth is going to have more growth for the decades ahead. You're not going to find that kind of opportunity anywhere else on the planet right now. But it's contingent on there being a basic agreed framework for what it means to work together in the world economy. That's what this negotiation is really about. And we're not going to know for sure whether Beijing is ready right now to put that on the table until much closer to March 2nd, unfortunately.
One question on IP, since that's always part of the topic, which is the enforcement issue. You can say a lot of things, but how do you enforce it? I've always thought you really can enforce it. The only real way to enforce it is actually through just competition, having much more competition in the marketplace. But what do you think they'd actually put in place? When you think about the framework for that?
Every now and then an economy has a chance to put some new piece of institutional governance down on the table. America did it with antitrust in the 1890s, and then again in the 1920s, where we put our money where our mouth was and says, we're actually going to break up the most powerful American companies on the planet, Standard Oil, to show we're dead serious about what it means to look after the
We've
consumer.
peeled away from that dead seriousness since the 1920s,
Well,
by
okay,
the way,
but China's now at one of those moments on intellectual property. So from January 1st, for the first time, they set up a new intellectual property court system under their own Supreme Court that has the potential to be that kind of game changer. Whether it is or not has everything to do with whether the Communist Party actually gives them the power to do what needs to be done. We know what needs to be done. Right. You need to actually protect people's intellectual property. We know what that looks like. We'll know pretty soon whether this time is going to be different.